So your immediate response to the election result?
And not one of surprise, to be honest. I thought the polling was going against Harris quite hard in the final couple of weeks. The momentum that they had built had evaporated largely. And I think we've got the narrow, essentially, outcome we expected. One shouldn't be deceived by the first past the post simple majority system. Trump has won less than 51% of the vote, somewhere between 50 and 51%. So this is a continuity election in that sense. The American politics has been swinging back and forth like this for more than a decade, 15 years, 20 years or so. And so it's that kind of outcome. To win not a single swing state is quite remarkable. So Harris has fallen well short of where Biden managed to be. But other than that, if you look at the breakdown, not that much has moved. So this is America, and this is the America the world has got to get used to living with, because nothing very dramatic has changed. It's a narrow margin one way or the other.
From the result is being formally announced, the rest of the world is trying to figure out what would that mean for them specifically. Now, generally speaking, what do you think the result might be having its impact on how the world is likely to move?
I mean, I think for large parts of the world, it doesn't change the course of American policy very much, to be honest. If you're thinking about a big Asian player like India, for instance, both sides of the American political spectrum want to be good friends with India. I think for China's position, unfortunately, is rather the opposite. There is a large consensus in Washington opposing in favor of a more confrontational position with China. The place where it swings most is probably where I am right now, which is Berlin in Europe, where a continuity Democrat administration would have been transatlanticist, heavily committed to supporting the struggle of Ukraine, and the Trump administration is likely to swing a very different direction. So for most of the world, I think there's continuity, though a new people in the White House, a new team, more erratic, less predictable, more transactional. And I think that's the key theme here. You can do business with Trump if you can offer him something that he's interested in. His team may be somewhat different, but the president himself is very much in that mindset. For the Europeans, because identity is at stake, the entire history of Cold War politics, Atlanticism's at stake, it's much more difficult because Trump is a figure outside that playbook. He just doesn't want to be part of that team or that kind of political culture.
Chinese presidents were among a long list of state leaders to congratulate the president-elect Donald Trump after the result was being announced. And he has been talking about cooperation rather than confrontation, which has always been China's tune in terms of policy. But specifically speaking, how realistic that's likely to be done?
I mean, I think the real question is what the Trump administration is going to be. The good upside here is the phase one trade deal Trump. It's very difficult to remember, but back in 2019, 2020, we had a White House that was celebrating the first phase of a trade deal transaction. And the problem, of course, is that Trump tends to surround himself with really quite hawkish advisors. And we also saw that in 2020. They're quite ideological. They're cold warriors, really, of a classic variety. There is also a large military-industrial complex in the US, which is heavily invested in ramping up military expenditure. And if that face comes forward, then relations between China and the United States, I'm afraid, will deteriorate. The one option that is no longer on the table with Trump is rules-based order, cooperation. That version of America's interaction is just not available from the Trump team. The best one that one can really hope for from them is a transactional deal-based approach. And on that basis, in some ways, the upside is potentially higher because the Biden team were, in their own way, liberal ideologues. They were Atlanticists. They were classic. They liked this contrast between democracy and autocracy, which made it very difficult for them, I think, to conceive of a positive end state for the relations between the United States and China. Whereas I don't think that's the case with Trump. So overall, one would hope that Beijing would find ways of coaxing the Americans into the higher end option here, which is some sort of transactional deal, and avoiding the possible slide into really quite dangerous escalation, which we did see in 2020.
interesting to talk about Asia because, as we know, Asia Pacific has been a very vibrant place, and the APEC Economic Leaders Meeting, APEC CEO Summit, is the occasion for how the region is likely to prosper. Now, the U.S. has been talking about under Biden administration, so-called the Indo-Pacific, but obviously, this Asia-Pacific concept is very, very strong. Your expectation as to what needs to be discussed to create synergy and create new way forward, as you just suggested.
I mean, I have to say this is quite a symbolic event, this, because you told me that you're going to be accompanying, I think, the Chinese delegation. You're going to be there. And so I Googled, and I had to Google because this is not a topic in American discourse right now. And that's really surprising because last year, after all, this was the occasion for a very significant meeting between the two sides. It was hosted in the United States. China's very significant investment in port infrastructure in Peru, for instance, which massively upgrades the container capacity of a potential significant node on the Latin American side of the Pacific, is immediately interpreted by American generals as a Chinese geopolitical play. And they literally ask, why would anyone invest like this on the main channels of trade? The implication being you'd only do that if you were aiming for geopolitical control, whereas the more obvious answer is you invest to expand container capacity on the main channels of global trade for trade. That's why you need the containers, right? So, but the lack of imagination and the willingness to interpret every such move as effectively a geopolitical power play is symptomatic, I think, of the rather limited horizons. De facto, what's happening there, and it's true across South America, and you won't find any argument there.
Very interesting, because there's a major port that China has been cooperating with Peru that's likely to be the place where you can dramatically shorten the time traveling by sea from South America to Asia, from 45 days to 10 days. That's dramatic for any businesses.
It's like these giant Supermax, whatever they're called, container ships with huge numbers of chips on them. So on the face of it, this is speeding up the global economy, enormously increasing efficiency. It will no doubt induce rivalry within South America, because if Peru builds this port, Chile will worry about its position. That's a healthy competition to see in a part of the world which really needs much deeper integration than it currently has.